On the last day of my time in Israel this week, I got a WhatsApp message from one of my cousins who lives there. "Are you in Israel?" he asked. He told me he'd seen one of my Facebook posts. Yes, I replied with not an insignificant amount of guilt, because I hadn't told him I was coming. I explained that I was on a very short and jam-packed mission with Magen David Adom, that's the Israeli version of the Red Cross. Ro'i, his wife Penina, and their two boys live in Bahan, which is hours north of Tel Aviv. There simply was no time to see him during this trip. "Hope you are all right," I messaged meekly. The reply came, "We are the same." If there was a pervasive feeling I had from my 4 days in Israel, it was that not much had changed from the last time I was there in late October. There's a sameness, a stuckness. The wounds of October 7th are open and painful because of the brutal murder of 1,200 human beings, because of the 134, now 133 hostages who remain in Gaza, Adar Katzir's body having been recovered. He was from Nir Oz, where I visited. And these hostages in the dark, for the most part, in terrible conditions, because of the staggering losses of life, the displacements, the incalculable costs of this war. I spoke with you on Shabbat Zachor about the scope of the horrors and our duty to remember. Today, I'll relate a few specific stories of what I saw and learned in Israel, but what I really want you to know is that Israelis to a person are still living through the trauma of October 7th. This is true for Noah, an Israeli Jew who was working the Jerusalem Magen David Adom dispatch center when they were flooded with calls. And because of the armies, the intelligence communities, the government's stunning failure to protect the South, had no way to stop the bleeding. She stared in disbelief at her screen. "What's wrong? Oh no." She stared in disbelief at her screen as the GPS revealed MADA ambulances stolen and taken into Gaza by Hamas, perversely weaponized for suffering instead of for their true purpose, which is to bring healing. It is true for Fadi as well, a Muslim Israeli Arab EMT and ambulance driver who lives in Beit Hanina in East Jerusalem, who came to work at Magen David Adom on October 7th and then on October 8th and every day since, just like his many Palestinian colleagues. Fadi was hosting Jewish and Christian friends and colleagues that evening for Iftar, the Ramadan breakfast. I asked Fadi if it had been difficult for him to reconcile his support for the country of which he's a citizen and the suffering of innocents in Gaza. Fadi was surprisingly adamant about the threat posed by Hamas and their depravity, about the need to defeat them. He said all the Palestinian Israelis that he knows feel the same way. He didn't take the bait at all. I was kind of floored, honestly. For Noah and Fadi, it was not April 4th. It was still October 7th. And it was October 7th for everyone else we met on this extraordinary and haunting trip, like Mishi Harman, host of the Remarkable Israel Story podcast, which reaches millions of listeners around the world with its wartime diaries. Mishi told us about how his late father David, the legendary educator and son of the Israeli ambassador, had joked that the Jerusalem air raid sirens on October 6th, 1973 were just, quote, kids playing on the roof with the antenna, and that he, Mishi, made a similar joke to his wife on October 7th, 2023, 50 years and one day later, because the truth was just so unfathomable. And it was still very much October 7th for survivors of Kibbutz Nir Oz, who led us through the devastation and reflected on the full 25% of their residents who had been slaughtered or kidnapped that Simchat Torah, including the Bibas family, Sherry and her 2 young children who remain in Gaza and whose house I visited. It's October 7th for families of soldiers on the front, displaced families from the north, Israelis most concerned about victory against Hamas, and Israelis most concerned about Israeli failures, like the gut-wrenching and inexcusable series of failures and protocol violations that led to the killing of 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen this week. It's October 7th for the head of Shaare Tzedek Hospital, who with 2 others was charged with making the determination that 36, now 37 although maybe they knew, of the 134 hostages are dead. Making that determination, as you could imagine, is hard because for the most part they're going on interviews and video footage and reflecting back from those who were liberated on what they saw and who they encountered when they were in Gaza. And it's October 7th for the Mossad psychologist who developed the protocols for receiving, processing, and supporting past and, God willing, future hostages when they return. It's still October 7th for the Zaka leader who was tasked with removing victim remains of the Nova Music Festival massacre from the site in the dark under heavy gunfire. They had to work quickly because they were afraid, with good reason, that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad would take the bodies of those who had been slaughtered into Gaza and hold them for ransom. He showed us photographs from his own iPhone. Evidence of torture, sexualized depravity inflicted on scores of victims, pre and post-mortem on that horrible day. And it's certainly October 7th for Polina Dov, the mother of 25-year-old Rachel Racheli Dov, whose mother was visiting the Nova site when we arrived. I watched her choke back tears as she dropped to her knees to weed the site around the makeshift memorial which marked her spot in the fields where Rachel and 340 young people were butchered. Rachel's boyfriend, Eliad, hid with her body in the car for hours while terrorists continued their assault. They were scheduled to travel together to Thailand in February. He was planning to propose. Paulina called her daughter her unicorn because she was unique and loved to sparkle. There was a little stuffed unicorn attached to a pole with her picture, a beautiful free spirit. Watching Paulina kneel in the dirt, 2 colleagues and I, not knowing what to do, just knelt beside her and pulled weeds while she kindled a tea light in a small glass container. However, I could spend the remainder of our time together detailing more horrors, but I think that's enough to give you a sense for why Israel is a nation in shock, stuck in a perverse Groundhog Day, which began 6 months ago this weekend. I would say it's a nation trapped in Shiva, but Shiva begins after the burial. Chazal, our rabbis, teach that we cannot mourn while our dead are before us. Many of the 1,200 who were murdered have been buried, or what little exists of their remains were buried, but many have not been found, either because their bodies were dragged to Gaza or because their deaths had to be confirmed through video evidence or written testimony. This is a nation whose dead are very much before them. And if I return with one message today, a single request from a traumatized nation, it is that their dead, and most especially the memory of their lives and legacy, should be before us too. The period between death and the catharsis of burial in our tradition is called aninut. Israel, until this war is ended, until our hostages are home, is a nation in perpetual aninut. But it's not just the sameness and the stuckness that pervades Israeli society and perhaps the entire Jewish people around the world on some level. It's a feeling of being completely overwhelmed. I feel that way. I bet a lot of you are feeling that way too. Today, as you know, is Shabbat HaChodesh, which officially kicks off the month of Nisan. I bet many of us are wondering how we can possibly celebrate our liberation, our freedom, when we are so very trapped by war, by animosity, by fear, by heartbreak. When over 130 souls are literally held in captivity. Soon at our Sedarim we'll sing Dayenu. It would have been enough. A song as ironic as it is meaningful, because of course it would not have been enough for God to redeem us from slavery, only to abandon us in the desert. But the word die, enough, is also related to the phrase yoter midai, too much. The stuckness of Israelis is compounded by being stuck in a state of overwhelmedness, too muchness. I don't want you to think that there is no life, no joy in Israel right now. Actually, there's plenty. Joy and humor amidst tragedy is how we've survived over thousands of years. It's our superpower. We had a silent dance party, rocking our headphones with refugee children from the north on the roof of the Dan Boutique Hotel. It was a blast. But still, October 7th hangs like a pall over everything, and the isolation that Israelis experience, their profound sense of feeling judged and misunderstood while their dead lie before them, while their children, grandparents, sisters, and brothers languish in captivity, and Netanyahu and his cronies ignore their suffering. It's all just yoter midai, too much. Which, while it doesn't justify Bibi's lack of horizon thinking or his many sins, explains why for so many Israelis it's been nearly impossible to imagine an eighth day, the day after the 7th of October. Our Parsha this week is Shemini, and it begins with an eighth day. Vayihi bayom hashmini kara Moshe la'aron u'levanav u'leziknei Yisrael. On the eighth day, Moses and Aaron called his sons, or Moses called Aaron and his sons and the elders of Israel. But our portion picks up in the middle of the story, and you might be wondering what happened on the seventh day. And the answer is that Aaron and his sons had been stationed at the entrance of the tent of meeting, preparing for service in the Mishkan as Kohanim. The seventh day marks the completion of the week-long ordination ceremony, preparations for the priests to begin their Kohanic duties. Interestingly, the term used in our portion is the one selected by Eliezer ben Yehuda for his modern Hebrew dictionary, meaning to supplement. The word miluim shares a root with malay, to fill, and it's come to describe the reserve duty so many soldiers have been completing during this war. So Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Eleazar, Itamar, they are filled up with their preparation for service, with their miluim. IDF soldiers fill out, right-size the army during the time of war, hence the term miluim. 600 soldiers have died since October 7th. 380 on the 7th itself, slaughtered in their homes. The Tatzpitaniot at Nahal Oz, the many reservists who rushed to the scene to fight Hamas, trying to save lives. The rest are enlisted, and those who have been called up from Miluim since. In other words, priests and soldiers are connected through a sense of service to Am Yisrael, and it was my great honor to stand in the Hall of Remembrance at Mount Herzl, Israel's national cemetery, and chant Al Malei Rachamim for each and every soldier who fell not during this war, but actually on that Hebrew date, which is the 24th of Adar Shemini. Since they do a tekes every day at 11 o'clock, an official daily military ceremony of remembrance with soldiers, and then a few colleagues were asked to lead the prayers, Kaddish, Perek Tehillim. I did Al Malei Rachamim, and it was broadcast for the families of the soldiers who fell in the various wars of Israel. But there's another connection that I think speaks to our own responsibilities as well. Between the Parsha and this moment, Aaron and his sons spend those 7 days in the Ohel Moed. This is usually translated tent of meeting, but Moed is more familiar to us as an appointed time, a sacred occasion, as in Moadim L'Simcha. And this is probably because time in our tradition, aside from Shabbat, is sanctified not by God, but by us. We proclaim the new month, as we just did for Nisan. We mark time by bearing witness to it, which is almost certainly why the word moed contains the word aid, which means witness. The priests are witness to the covenantal relationship between God and Israel. They bear witness to time by marking sacred and solemn occasions. That's why I went to Israel for my second trip since October 7th, to bear witness once again, and also to take note of how things have evolved since October. But what I discovered is that they haven't. For all the reasons I mentioned and more, they are stuck in the raw intensity, the trauma, the yoter midai of that 7th day of October. And so I ask, how might we move forward? If Israelis, like Aaron and his sons, are to enter October 8th, what might we do to get there? A lot of it is, of course, just time. Healing takes time. Mor Tzarfati, the young mother who led us around kibbutz Nir Oz, who survived nearly 11 hours in her safe room with her 3 children and their dog, while Hamas set fire to the house around them, and they had to sip air through a cracked window. Mor feels she is only living for her children now, that there is no true happiness to be found for her, and I really hope she's wrong. On our last day in Jerusalem, we visited with the leadership of Natal, which does incredible work around trauma and resilience. They spoke about not post-traumatic stress, but a new way that it's being conceptualized as post-traumatic growth. The problem, they explained, is that trauma-informed care is usually about acknowledging the event which caused the trauma is over, so that now you can focus on healing and growth and not reliving the past event over and over as if it's today. But since the events of October 7th are not over, it's hard for true healing and growth to begin. Even the caregivers we spoke with from Natal describe their shared reality, is what they call it, a shared reality, that they too are in the army, or who have kids who are there, or who have family and friends who were murdered or kidnapped. Who heals the healers? Other healers, it seems. Natal, through their helpline and network of therapists and caregivers, have scaled up to meet the moment. And so one thing that you can do is learn more about Natal and to support their work. I'll say, just as an aside, it happened to be that my colleague, my former senior rabbi from Chicago, was on the trip, and he was telling me that they had done work with Natal in a partnership with a Black Christian church in the city in Chicago, and that having gone to Israel together, this pastor, Pastor Harris, learned about the work of Natal and said, we really need something like that here in Chicago. And they've now actually created a helpline in Chicago in partnership with Natal, which has done trainings for a number of churches in the city of Chicago, and to date they've received 50,000 calls to this helpline. Really extraordinary. Another thing you can do is learn about and support Magen David Adom. So a final story. One of the sites we visited during our trip was their massive new blood center in Ramleh. But I learned the facility is not simply about receiving, sorting, and storing blood underground and protected from missile strikes. It also has a groundbreaking breast milk bank. They had a wall that had a bunch of donor stars on it. They call it the Milky Way. I thought that was kind of cute. That milk bank was instrumental in feeding the infant son of 33-year-old Adi Kaplun Vital, whose parents, Jackie and Yaron, we met in Jerusalem in our second to last day. Adi was extraordinary, and I hope to share more of her story another time. But for now, I'll just say that when she was murdered on Kibbutz Cholit, living behind 2 children, the Mada Milk Bank helped sustain her baby. I was truly inspired by the work of Mada, and I would strongly encourage you to learn more, and if so inclined, make a donation to them. Some rabbis and leaders who joined us had even had their synagogue sponsor and name an ambulance proudly deployed throughout the land of Israel, serving anyone in need, as with any Red Cross affiliate, without regard to region or nationality. Showing up for Israelis, bearing witness, helping them feel supported and less isolated is one very meaningful thing that we can do to help them eventually reach October 8th. My cousin in Bachan says they are the same. It is in nobody's interest for Israel to remain indefinitely stuck on October 7th. And if you have sensed a sense of an inability from not all, but some Israelis to feel sufficient empathy for the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I also think that's trauma-informed. And I say that not to justify, but just to try to understand. And they can't move forward alone. They need one another, and yes, they need us too. The Talmud in Masechet Brachot tells a story of suffering and redemption. Rabbi Chia bar Abba fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan went to visit him. He said to him, "Is suffering precious to you?" Rabbi Chia said to him, "Not it, and not its reward." And so Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "Give me your hand," and he gave him his hand, and he restored him to health. And then Rabbi Yochanan, who had helped Rabbi Chia, he fell ill. And Rabbi Hanina went to visit him, and he said, "Is your suffering precious to you?" And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "Not it, and not its reward." And Rabbi Hanina said to him, "Give me your hand." And he gave him his hand, and he restored him to health. And the Talmud then asked the questions, well, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan just restore himself? After all, he was able to heal Rabbi Chia. And the response is that a prisoner cannot free himself from prison. Israelis are stuck. They're trapped within the horrors of October 7th. They are working to free themselves, but they also need our help. And as the American Jewish community has been doing for 75 years since the founding of the state, I hope that we can continue to be that help. By writing letters, by donating funds, by calling friends and family, by pushing back against reductive assertions and vilification. And they, as I was reminded once again, can be our help too. So if you can, go to Israel. Visit and see for yourself, as Rabbi Dratch will be doing this week. If you go, maybe you'll join the protests that have been reinvigorated against the government and calling for the release of hostages. There are competing ideas within Israeli society about how best to prosecute this war and how to decide what gets foregrounded. The issue of hostages, the issue of civilians, the issue of defeating Hamas. Go see. Ask questions. Rav Tyler, we wish you safe travels and meaningful encounters on your journey. And I say to all of us, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh, something that we should remind ourselves of in this year of Am, not just during the Purim Spiel, but every day, that all of Am Yisrael is bound to one another, prisoners, healers, setting each other free. That feels like a good goal in the coming month as we celebrate our collective liberation. Shabbat Shalom.